After we created a developer project in each of the social networks we will use for alternative logins, taken the information from those projects in the form of a public and private key, added those keys to the project properties, configured the redirect URLs that will be added back into the social network projects, and then added it to web security, we can now add the information to a web component to allow us to use the alternative logins. This particular process is currently only available in a UX component. If we look at a UX component here, we can see this UX component has a username and password. For logging in from an external source such as Google or Facebook, we do not need a username or password. However, the user may have a password already configured within the Office security system, and they could use those credentials if they so wished. If we look at the properties here, we can see in the UX properties, under login, we can use integrated login functionality. We also check that it has integrated alternative login functionality. The reason we would have these two different options is it allows us to set a placeholder for login errors regardless of how we are logging in. We also have it checked that log out does a full page reload. We can customize our login failure messages. As we can see here, we can customize our login failure messages for different languages. For instance, we can show all the default methods that are available. This list will change whether alternative login is turned on or off. And we can put in the default messages, or we can put in the ones we wish to use. Come back to the controls. We can use a button, a link, or an image to do the alternative login. In this case, we're using buttons. If we take a look at one of the buttons, we can see we have chosen to log in with an alternative login provider in the action JavaScript. If we edit the action, the only option in this is to select the named provider we wish to use. In this case, we're going to just select the Google test. Note we're only checking the name of the provider. We are not checking the actual credentials. The credentials are stored in the project properties or in the publish profile, and those can change at publish time. By using a named provider, we do not have to re-edit this UX component later. Although the properties do show an after login event in the server-side events, these events are not used because the page does a full reload if we're using an alternative login. Therefore, we have to use the login event in the security settings to get the effect we wish. However, on the client side, there is a can login event. The can login event does fire on the client side prior to going out to an alternative login provider. This particular component will now allow us to log in using alternative methods, as you can see here. Once we have logged in, we also can edit some of the information. For example, we may wish to add a Google login or a Facebook login to an existing Alpha Web Security user. To do this, we're going to look at some other options. In this particular case, this component has a list component. The list component is filled by a custom data source, which is filled by an XBasic function name. If we go into the XBasic functions, we'll see this function, which we call extauth, simply gets a list of alternative logins for the current user. So the current user may have no alternative logins or may have multiples. This will just fill the list component with the list of alternative logins for this particular user. Come out to the controls here. This user may have one or more logins or may not have any. So we have a button here to add a Google login to the current logged in user. As you can see, the action JavaScript method is a little different. We're adding alternative login to the current user. We're going to edit the action. Once again, we select the named authentication provider, in this case Google, and we also will put in the list control. The reason we're adding the list control is if we add a login for a different provider, it will update the list control to show the change. At the same time, we have a button here to delete selected. This will allow us to select a record in the list control, and we can select the list control with a record to delete. Once we select one in there, it can delete that alternative login. If the only login for the user is from that social network, we can't delete the last authentication for that user, and therefore we would get a message.